Thanks very much. Well, welcome everybody. First I'd like to say congratulations on getting this far down your medical career path. I know exams are next week, and you've probably got a lot of information zooming around there in relation to what will be in those exams, but for the next hour or so, if you can just park those thoughts and we'll expose you to some other information from the financial world which you may not have been exposed to thus far. Now, there's a few things that we'll run through today. The first thing is the importance of thinking ahead. You need to make sure that you do create your future by what you do in the present. Now, there's a lot of actions, and everyone talks about actions and consequences. You would see things more so if people have injuries or what have you, and they may not have thought about what they were doing before they did it. From my side, we get to see that in the financial realm, where either they do end up with a lot of extra cash that they may want or be working towards, or they may end up in some sort of financial dire straits based on the decisions that they make at different points in time. So in today's workshop, we're going to run through some of your personal and professional goals, and we're going to consider the decisions that you make in the early parts of your career and how that can then play into basically your financial position in the middle and then later half of your career and your financial security over that time. We will touch on some different investment strategies that you can use along the way, and the main thing is to set yourself up so that you can fulfil those goals that you are trying to achieve. We'll touch on different terms like assets, liabilities and passive income. You may have encountered some of these before. You may not have a great understanding of what those terms are about, but we'll explore that more during the presentation today. And we will also be talking about your potential future income earning capacity and what things you could be thinking about doing with those extra funds. Leave that for now. We'll come back to that as we go through the presentation. Now, everyone should have a workbook in front of them. We'll be going through that through the course of today. If there's any questions on the way through, feel free to ask those at any point in time. It's a bit of a two-way street in that respect. So if there's something that we touch on that you're not quite familiar with or want to delve into further, feel free to ask questions and we can run through things there. So to begin, I'd like you to just jump onto page 2 of the workbook, and I'd like you to spend a couple of minutes just to brainstorm what your short term being, say, 3 years, medium term being 6 years, and longer term being 10 years, what your personal and professional goals are. These might include things like around the world trips, either getting married or starting a family. It could be purchasing a particular item, be it a house, a boat or a car. It could be competing or attending some sort of sporting event if you're into rugby union and want to watch the Wallabies play around the world or something like that. It could also be or pursuing your career specialisation. So I know at this point in your journey, you might have some sort of idea of where you want to head, although that might still be being formulated as things pan out. It could even be things like starting your own medical practice or even taking on some sort of medical charity work. So that's just a few ideas to start with. The next thing that I'd like you to do, as you'd see in that form, is to try and identify or outline some sort of idea of what the estimated cost of those goals may be. Now, if it's a round the world trip, you could pretty easily put, say, $10,000 in the estimated cost column, and that might be high or low depending on how it is you want to travel. However, we've got on the next page there, if anyone is thinking about getting married, there's some good statistics that the average Australian wedding costs around $36,000 odd. That can be higher or lower. It could be as high as $50,000. It all depends on how you want to get married, I suppose. But it gives you an idea of how you can then break down those costs as far as what is involved and what things you're going to be having there. So we'll just do that for the next 4 minutes and then we'll come back to you from there. Has anyone got any questions at this stage? Okay. Who would like to share one of their short-term goals? So we're talking 3 years.
Pay off some
Very worthy. How much do you think that would be at the moment? Okay. Yep. And that will happen of its own accord once your income starts to increase over time anyway. Yeah. No, that's fine. Anyone else? Short term? New Zealand or the world?
Like overseas.
Okay.
Like as many breaks as you can get.
How ballpark cost?
Like maybe 10 grand.
Okay. And that's where, well, there's always that sort of sticker price, if you want to call it that. Like buying the airfare is one thing. Accommodation, hire cars, like touring, travel insurance, all those sort of things. Depending on where you're going, some of those things can morph pretty quickly. Let's talk about medium-term goals. So 3 to 6 years. Is anyone thinking 3 to 6 years ahead? Deposit on a house, yep. And that can be a how long's a piece of string question as far as how much you might need, depending on the house as well. Anyone else?
Like starting specialty training with exams and more courses like that.
Which is probably another one of those how long's a piece of string questions as far as cost to make that work. That's fine. And then let's talk longer term, 10 years. Has anyone got any big audacious goals there? Want to own a house in the Bahamas or anything like that?
Pay off the first house first.
Gotcha. Yep. Well, and the main thing is, well, apart from identifying what goal it is or what you are trying to achieve, it's always worth trying to outline your best estimate of the cost of that so that you can then see how that fits into your financial plan. If someone says they want to buy a Ferrari for 400 grand, well, that's all good. But then, number one, where do they get 400 grand from? Number two, what are all the other costs that come with that apart from insurance and repairs and all these other bits and pieces too? So identifying the goal is always the first step. Identifying them, what that may cost and how that fits in with the rest of the game plan is the next relevant point to make. Now, as you start to reflect on these goals, it's also important to establish if they are congruent or conflicting. As an example, as a self-employed businessman, I can't aspire to work 80 plus hours a week, still plan to have lots of quality time with my wife and 3 children, and still maintain healthy exercise and sleep routines. Everyone only has 24 hours in a day. You have to then figure out what will be given priorities and how is it all going to fit in there to make it work. So in a similar way, from a financial point of view, you can't simultaneously spend all of your money on things that you may want or need or want to have now, and also save money for a house or save money for the future. So one of the things that we'll be touching on as we go through is to try and prioritise of the goals. You've identified which ones are short-term, medium-term and long-term, and the other thing that we need to be looking at is how critical are those goals or how important are they in the scheme of things. Buying a house, having a car, they're things that you have to have. Does the house have to have gold taps and be worth multi-million dollars? Possibly not. Does the car need to be a Ferrari? Possibly not as well. So some of the things that we talk about from a goal point of view might be nice to have, but it's then a matter of, well, can you fund that and where does that money come from? So one of the focuses of today's workshop is to discuss how people can achieve their financial freedom, and learning to save and invest is the cornerstone of how to achieve this. Your aim should be to develop good savings habits early, and unfortunately most Australians get caught up in bad patterns of spending, and once those habits are established it can be hard to change those further down the track. So, focusing in on financial goals, it's critical to understand the difference between an asset and a liability. While many doctors may look rich by having nice cars, big houses and good lifestyles, some are rich and some are not. Some own their houses outright, while others are renting or may have huge mortgages that they have to then keep paying off over time. Some of the luxury cars may be fully owned, while others may be leased or may have been purchased entirely on finance. So they may only own the steering wheel and the rest of it is still owned by the bank effectively. Truly wealthy doctors learned early on the difference between an asset and a liability, and there'll be a presentation about that now. But a simple definition is an asset is something that makes you money, while a liability costs you money. We'll watch a brief clip now so that we can explain things a bit easier for you, and then we'll come back after that.
Here's little Robert Kiyosaki. He has two fathers. One of them has a PhD, the other never finished 8th grade. Both earn substantial incomes, yet one always struggles financially, while the other is going to become one of the richest men in Hawaii. One is going to die leaving tens of millions of dollars to his family. The other is going to leave bills to be paid. The problem with financial education is that it isn't taught in schools, so the family decides to teach it. Now the problem with this is that unless your parents are in the top 1%, they are going to teach you how to be poor. Not because they don't love you, they just don't know what they're teaching, and they don't read books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad. My story is very similar. I was taught how to be poor. Then I went to the Air Force Academy and studied economics and took accounting and investing classes. I did complicated regressions on economic data and balanced complex balance sheets. Yet I've received more pragmatic advice by reading a single book from Kiyosaki than I did by taking 4 years of complicated classes. I never had a rich dad, but I have many rich dads now. Klassen, Kiyosaki, Hill, DeMarco, the list goes on. So if you weren't born in the top 1%, let's learn from Kiyosaki, who learned from his rich dad. You have to know these two words, assets and liabilities. Now, forget what you might have learned in your accounting classes. We're going to define them in very simple terms. An asset is anything that puts money in your pocket. A liability is anything that takes money from your pocket. Anything can be an asset or a liability. If you own a house and it eats $1,000 a month, then it's a liability. If you own a house and it brings in $1,000 a month, then it's an asset. Assets are things like businesses, real estate, paper assets, things like stocks and bonds. Here's why knowing this distinction is so important. Really try to focus on this. The poor only have expenses. The rich buy assets. And the middle class buy liabilities that they think are assets. After graduating, if I had followed everybody's advice, I would have gotten a job which increases my income. But there are so many problems with that. As I got my job, my girlfriend and I would have moved into a bigger house. We would have gotten a BMW in addition to our Mustang. I would have bought the iPhone 6. The problem with all of this is that I would think I was acquiring assets while I was actually acquiring liabilities. I would have to pay every month for the house, for the car, for my expensive phone. In essence, unless you make a paradigm shift about what you do with your money, which is to buy actual assets, no matter how much income you earn from your job, you will just match it with your liabilities and expenses. Your friends might admire your iPhone 6 and you might look rich, but you will never actually be rich. Now, there's nothing wrong with having your job. I just don't have one because I'm operating from the assets quadrant. But if you are following the standard narrative of going to school and getting a job, chances are you're acquiring liabilities which you think are assets. That is the problem. So keep your job, but make sure what you earn goes mostly towards real assets rather than liabilities that seem like assets. And yes, eventually when you acquire enough assets, you won't need your job either. It absolutely blows my mind how people say, well, what if I lose money with the business, or the real estate, or the paper assets? They don't say the same thing about buying their second enormous TV, which will be worthless in a year, and which creates a liability every month. I would rather lose all of my money starting a business than lose it by buying yet another TV I don't need. Even if I lost all my money, the lessons learned from starting a business would be infinitely more valuable than watching Dr. Phil. Here's another problem. It's not how much money you make, it's how much money you keep. If I told you I was going to pay you $1 million a month, but then I took away $999,999 $999, you'd have to be an idiot if you said you were making $1 million. My dad told me, become a doctor and you will be rich. Yet a doctor pays a half or even more of what he earns just to the government. You get taxed when you earn, you get taxed when you spend, you get taxed when you save, and guess what? You get taxed when you die. On the other hand, you could operate from the assets quadrant and pay sometimes 0% in taxes. I have doctor friends who are more financially anxious than my absolutely broke friends.
Any questions about that video? Now, turn over to page 4 on your workbook for me, please. And what I'd like you to do is just have a few minutes to run through or to prepare your own list of what you think are assets and what you think are liabilities. Okay, who can give me their top liabilities that they've identified? Car? Correct. Next. The car very rarely would end up in the asset column. Cars and their values is basically one-way traffic, and we've got a bit of an example to run through about that soon. But yeah, if it's a new car, you drive it off the lot, you're losing value straight away, and that value will never get recouped. Even some of the classics that are out there very rarely go up in value. Next liability? Travel. Yep. It's good from an experience point of view, but it doesn't necessarily generate any income for you, correct? Another one? Plasmas? Yep. TVs, correct? Yep. Correct? Yep. And that's where we do have to weigh up the necessity versus what it is. Like, you know, you have to have a car, you have to have a roof over your head. So some of those things, you have to have food. You can't avoid that. However, if it's a 50-inch TV or a 65-inch TV, is that a necessity? Do you have to have it? Is it a liability? What about assets? What's some of the best assets that we've got written down?
Like if you own a house now, right?
Okay, so something that's going to produce you income, correct?
Share portfolio.
Correct? Correct. Okay, so you get the gist. Now, so there are many different types of assets. As we touched on, cash in the bank can generate interest. Shares can be directly held or maybe held through some sort of managed fund portfolio and will generally generate income from them directly anyway. If you do invest in individual shares, it's also possible to increase your return by selling what they call put and call options. Again, it all comes down to assessing the risk that you're getting yourself into and what's the downside if these things don't go the way that you plan. In the real estate game, we touched on houses. That could be one house in the suburbs that's rented out and just brings in income in that respect. It could be multiple unit dwellings, it could be subdivisions, it could be other things like that, or building spec houses and those sort of things. Again, you have to be aware of what risks are you taking on, what's the potential for return, and what's the actual chance of this thing panning out the way that you plan. Buying into a business is another way of securing an asset that can make you money. The tricky part with that is that generally you have some sort of labour input that has to be managed and also costs you money every day. And the big thing is you need to be trying to make sure that any business that you may be looking to get into does fit in well with your other occupation or time. So if you were in a hospital 60 plus hours a week, then owning an interest in a cafe around the corner where the cook or the barista doesn't turn up and you've got to go and help out there may not be a congruent way of making that work. However, if you were to have, say, some cattle that are out just grazing and doing their thing, It's a totally different business, but you aren't going to have the cattle ringing you up saying we need to be fed and watered and all those sort of things. So it's not. So sometimes you can end up with businesses that will align in a better way with what your primary activity is, and sometimes we come across people who've actually ended up with 2 or 3 primary types of businesses, and that's fine while everything goes fine, but if things start to fall off the rails, they can't be in 3 places at once, and then they can be even more exposed than what they would be otherwise. Now, with all of those different things that we've touched on, I've personally invested in all of those different asset classes over time, as have a number of my clients, so we sort of know the ins and outs of how they work and what risks people are sort of being exposed to in that respect. Now, the overall advice is to make sure that you diversify your assets so that not all of your eggs are in one basket. You would have all heard of that at some point in time. It's just a matter of making sure that if what you're invested in either doubles or halves, that you don't have everything exposed in that one type of asset class. And it's also critically important to understand yourself how those different investments work. If it is something like money in the bank, like a term deposit, and you understand that you put the money in, they pay you interest and the risk is relatively low, well, that's about as simple as it gets. If you start getting into properties or subdivisions or other types of investments where there's a lot of different moving parts, then you really have to have a good understanding of what it is you're getting into, because the time to determine what the upside and downside is before you actually buy it or make that investment. Now, the other thing is, when it comes to buying in at the right time, it can be critical, and most people would say that you make your money when you buy, not when you sell. If you buy a house in the suburbs as an investment property, and if you've paid over the odds for what it's really worth, then it just means that it may take a hell of a lot longer for that market to increase in value for you ever to even get your initial outlay back. So it really means that while there are many groups out there that are selling investment opportunities, sometimes they may be operating in their best interests, not yours. So the main theme here is it's a bit of buyer beware. Ensure that you fully understand what it is that you're getting into before you sign the contract or proceed with it. Ask as many questions as you need to get a better understanding of what is going on, and make sure that you've got as complete an understanding of what it is and the upside and downside risks before you decide to proceed down that path. Now, the main point of generating assets is to create passive income streams. These income streams can either supplement your salary or in time can replace your salary, so working your normal job can become optional. Passive income is generated when you have to put very little time in to gain the funds. So we touched on income coming in from a term deposit. All you have to do is have the money in the bank to generate that interest. You don't have to actually have any sort of physical exertion and generate that interest, and the amount of interest that you earn will be dependent on how much money is in the bank, regardless of how much time you've got available to coordinate that. Dividends from shares are in a similar sort of boat, where you own the shares, they'll just send you the cheque in the mail or directly credit it into your account. If you've got a rental property, this one is not or doesn't necessarily always need to be all hands off. If you have a sort of, if you lean towards wanting to get your hands dirty and do some renovations or do some painting or things like that, well, then there's always plenty of opportunity to do those sorts of jobs. If you don't want a bar of any of those sort of physical activities, there's always plenty of tradespeople around to take on that work and get it done, albeit it will impact on your return, and it may also burn some of your time to be able to coordinate those things that need to happen. Sometimes, even when it comes to the ongoing rental of that property or the management of that rental, some people will manage those properties themselves, which then does burn some of their time. Other people will just farm that out to a real estate agent who will collect the rent and keep an eye on it and do the inspections and provide the report. So it really depends. Like the rental properties is one where you can be more involved or less involved depending on what your time availability and level of interest is. Likewise, if you do own a business which is managed and staffed by others, your role in that business ideally should be to provide a a strategic level of where the business is headed and what needs to be done, rather than being the one who's out the back either making the coffees or flipping the burgers or doing whatever the type of business is. Because otherwise, if you start doing those things very quickly, you can end up being drawn into that business as well, which may be generating a lower rate of return than what you would be if you were doing what you've been spending so long being trained to do. So having passive income does provide you with financial freedom. If the working conditions are not to your liking or you are made redundant, you are no longer reliant on that job and you can choose to retire early or live off those income streams if you wish. So the main thing is that the more or the higher the level of passive income that you have, the more options that you have, and it doesn't necessarily need to be spent on lifestyle, but you've got that discretion to do that if that's what you want to. So while putting money or your money in assets sounds like a great plan, there's also liabilities that you may need. We've touched on the car, we've touched on the house. The challenge is to make sure that you're putting money into assets as well as potentially trying to restrict your liabilities, so that you don't fall into the trap, which many do, which is thinking that a liability is actually an asset. Now, we're going to run through a couple of case studies. The first one will be an example of purchasing a car, just so that you can see how that may or may not work, and then we're going to look at three common investments. One's term deposits, one's shares, and then one's a residential rental property. So, for many people, buying a decent car is one of the first things they want to do when money becomes available. Many people don't take the time to calculate the real cost of buying and owning a car. So, as you're aware, apart from the actual purchase price, you've got ongoing registration, you've got ongoing servicing, ongoing fuel, and things like that, and insurance. However, the other element that a lot of people don't necessarily see would be the annual decrease in the value of the car that they've got. If you go and buy a $5,000 clunker that gets you by, it's fair to say it may not be reducing by that much. If you're buying yourself a $400,000 Ferrari, well, you're going to be basically ripping up cash all over the place year after year as the value decreases. So, and the other thing is that if you also borrow money to buy the car, you've also got that added interest bill. So it's an extra cost that you will wear, but that interest bill and the interest that you pay has absolutely no bearing on the value of the car when you want to go and sell it. So if you bought a car for, say, 30 grand and you've paid 3 grand of interest on that, in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, it's still going to be worth 20 grand, the same as whether you just paid for it with cash. So the extra interest is a cost that you have to bear, but it provides no benefit to you at all. So the bottom line is that you're very, very unlikely to ever make money off a car. They often cost you far more than you think, because sometimes people just use the reference cost, or their reference cost is just the purchase price. And you need to be also factoring in what that annual reduction is to just to get your head around how much you may be losing from that point of view. Now, we've just looked at, we've jumped onto car sales and we said, okay, most people are familiar with a Toyota Land Cruiser. There's the first one there is a 2015 GXL. The purchase price was $96,000. The second one was one that was the same model, 5 years old. It was listed there about $65,000. The next one was the same car but 10 years old, and its purchase price was, say, 25 grand. So if we assume that you had 50 grand available, and the question is, well, I need a car, what should I do? Under scenario one, you'd put all of that 50 grand in and then borrow an extra $47,000. So you'd then be accruing interest cost of the $3,290. You'd still have the same registration, insurance, you'd have some servicing, some fuel. So your estimated annual running costs are around about $8,000. However, if you look at the difference between 96 and 65, the reduction in value of that same vehicle over that 5-year period is around about $31,000. So your annual cost per year is around about 14.5 grand. Scenario two, it's got similar, well, less interest because you're borrowing a bit less, similar running costs overall, and the annual cost there is, say, $14,400, so comparable to the first one. The third option, which is the 2005, if you were to only outlay 25 grand, you wouldn't have any interest costs, and the other 25 grand could be invested to generate some interest on that anyway, which is going to reduce your overall costs. It'd be fair to say, well, the registration would be the same, insurance would be the same, the servicing would be, it'd be fair to say that the servicing may be a bit higher if it's an older car and may have a few things that are starting to not quite work. The fuel we've just assumed is the same. So the annual running costs are slightly lower overall because there's no interest in there. The reduction in value for 5 years was only $10,000 because it's going to go from 25 down to about 15. Therefore, your annual cost per year is around 7,800. So, to clarify, I'm not saying go and buy a 20-year-old car and everything will be fine, because sometimes you can buy one that may cost a lot more to maintain. But the main point is that buying new is okay, but you just have to be aware of what the total reduction in value is, because when you take that car back to trade it in or to move it on, I would rather be driving the 2005 one and have less of an annual cost, because then you can generate more income from what's left over, rather than going with the greatest, newest one that you can just because you can, if you know what I mean. Does anyone have any questions about that slide and those calculations, or where we're coming from there? Who's driving a car that's worth more than 20 grand now? That's okay. That's fine. Who wants to drive a car that's worth 100 grand? That's basically the point that we're coming back to. So at the end of the day, as long as you're aware of how much you may be burning through, that's the main thing, because a lot of people don't consider those elements. Okay, we're now going to look at another 3 examples, and this is still based on our 50 grand that we had to start with. If we look at a straight term deposit based on 3% return, we would be generating $1,500 per year. I've just picked NAB shares as another example. Their annual rate of return at that point in time was around 7% or 7.7%. So as a result, the return there would be higher. However, the main thing is that being a share, you are exposed to upside and downside. So the value of shares goes up and down every day, as we know. So as a result, you may not be guaranteed to have your $50,000 there in 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, or what have you. So with the potential for a higher yield or higher return, you are also taking on higher risk. Now, the third one there, which is the rental property, this one is just to give you an example of how things may work in that space. If you had 50 grand, if you borrowed 250 and bought a $300,000 property, then your ongoing costs would be around about $6,700. That would include things like rates and insurance and a bit of maintenance and things like that. And you'd also be getting you'd have interest costs there rather than earning money on the interest. You'd have interest costs to outlay, and you'd also be getting some rent received. So if we assume this is a house that you've rented out to someone else, not a house that you're living in, then when we look at that example, we end up with a negative 5,060 or a negative 1.68%, which you may quite rightly say, well, why would you even entertain something like that? Now, this next slide outlines, it's actually a house that my wife purchased a few years ago. 2005, the cost was $168,000. We've done some improvements to it. The total interest paid was $33,000. So the total costs to date has been $217,000. Now, it's been recently valued at $300,000, and so the average increase per annum is $7.5 grand. So while you may have a cash loss of around $5,000 per year, if the capital value increases by more than what your cash loss is, well, then you can still be ahead overall. And there's other tax elements which I won't really go into, but if the value of the property stayed still and just went sideways for that same period, then quite rightly you'd say, well, hang on, we've just been burning $5 grand a year, we're not really going ahead in any way, shape or form. However, if the value increases by more than what the cash loss is, well, then that's when you can be ahead. And from a income tax point of view, you would only be taxed on that after you've actually sold it and crystallised a capital gain is the term that they use. So one of the main elements about this though is the total interest paid there of $33,000. When that house was purchased, there was more than the 20% that had been saved to go into that deposit. And then the main aim over that whole time of having it was to pay off that debt as quickly as possible to reduce that interest cost. Sometimes people will say, well, we'll just put it on interest only and we'll let it sit there and it'll increase in value and then everything will be fine. If it does increase in value, well then that might not be so bad, but from a defensive point of view, it is best to be reducing that debt over time. To reduce the debt takes cash that you've saved from your normal income and expenses. So that's why getting into those savings habits early can help firstly save up to get that house deposit, but then secondly to pay off that residual debt to get that free and clear as soon as you can. So that's basically the main aim, should be to reduce the debt quickly. Now, people will also touch on this term being good debt versus bad debt. We'll explore that a little bit shortly, but the main thing is the more cash that you can pump in to reduce those loans, the lower the interest costs, the better the numbers work out across the board. Does anyone have any questions about those examples?
How does negative gearing play into that?
Okay, with that one there, the previous slide, the $5,000 loss, what happens is that $5,000 would then be offset against your income in your own name, and effectively what that means is that the tax that you would have paid on that $5,000 would then be refunded to you. So let's just assume that if you didn't have the property at all on that $5,000, let's just assume you would have paid $2,000 of income tax. By having this loss from an income tax point of view, therefore your income is $5,000 less, therefore the $2,500 tax you would have paid would now no longer need to be paid, so it would be refunded to you in sort of straightforward terms, if you know what I mean. That's negative gearing is always a hot topic that gets thrown around every few months from a different government point of view. At this stage, while they might be talking about it, there's nothing firm to say that there's going to be any changes on that sort of front. But that's where the tax effect of that would really mean that if it was $2,000 that you were going to save, then your net after tax cost is really only, say, $3,000. Whereas when you look at the value increase, so you're really comparing $3,000 versus, say, $7,500 on the other side. And the other thing to touch on is that when it comes to the growth of property values, as we've seen even locally for the last little while, not everything just goes up indefinitely. Property values do go up and down, and also when they go up, they may spend anywhere from 5 to 7 years going practically sideways. So it's not a bulletproof strategy to say, well, I'll buy this at 300 and in 2 years it's going to be worth 350 and then we'll sell it and we'll do this and that. Basically, any sort of investment in property should be considered to be a longer term, say at least 3 to 5 year investment, because sometimes things don't move as quickly as other spots. Yeah, does that clarify that for you? Cool. Okay, so the top tips. Holding assets becomes significantly easier if you're not burdened with large debts. When reducing debts, you need to know the difference between good debt and bad debt, or what we would call deductible debt and non-deductible debt. When buying investments, interest costs are deducted from your income, which then saves you tax. However, if you have loans for personal things like your credit cards, like your home loan for the house that you would live in, or if there's any debt on a private vehicle or private loan or something like that, the interest on those loans are not deductible at all. So when we talk about good debt, if it was debt on a share portfolio, debt on a residential rental property, something that will be making you income, then we would tend to use the term good debt because it's debt that the interest is deductible on. When it's debt that is private debt or non-deductible debt, well, that's what people would bandy about and say, well, that's bad debt. So anyone who does have a $6,000 credit card bill that they can't pay, and they then get charged 18 to 20% on that. Like that 18 to 20% interest cost that they pay is of no tax benefit to them at all. Therefore, it's considered to be bad. Okay, so that's why credit cards, they're always priority number one to wipe out, or at least pay off and get rid of. So when it comes to paying off those personal expenses, to get the most bang for your buck, you should be looking to start paying off the debt with the highest interest rate first. So if you've got credit cards with an interest rate of 18 to 20%, nail those ones first, and then next it might come down to potentially a car loan that might be around that 8 to 10%, and then it could be the home that you live in that might be around that 5 to 7%, depending on what rates are at the time. So basically that should be your strategy to repay that debt, and then on the other side, so that you don't keep digging a bigger hole for yourself, you need to be making sure that you've got a good handle on what you're spending the money on, what your personal expenditure is, so that you don't go and pay off $3,000 of credit card debt here, and then you get the next statement and there's another $3,000 there. So those habits of making sure that you're aware of where the money's going to is pretty critical and good to establish early, because then it puts you in a better seat over time. So the moral of the story is that there's no foolproof way of making money. I can guarantee that your car will not make you money, neither will overseas holidays, big screen TVs or dining out. Many people consider the family home as their main investment, but again, it isn't going to generate any money, and if you're going to be carrying a substantial burden of debt, then it can be treated as a liability for the purposes of what we've been talking about with the presentation thus far. Investments like property and shares are likely to increase in value over the longer term, and they also do help pay their way through rent and dividends. However, when you are buying or investing into those assets, it does need to be carefully planned and thought out before you get to that point, so that you're aware of what risks you're taking on. And even when it comes to dividends, those returns can be variable. Companies can make good decisions and bad decisions. So just because NAB might be 7% now, in 2 years' time it could be 3%, or they might just cut the dividend completely depending on what's going on. If you invest wisely, you will see your passive income stream grow over time, making you less reliant on your job and giving you more financial freedom. However, it is critical to make sure that you do your own due diligence about these investments. And there are plenty of people who will prey on young or naive investors, so make sure you've done your homework and understand the economics of what you're buying into. And as I touched on before, you do make your money when you buy, not when you sell. Now, while it's good to invest in assets early in your career so they have maximum time to grow, it's also important to get your savings and spending habits right. You can't survive for long on a diet of 2-minute noodles. I know some of you might have tried so far. But on the other side, or the other extreme, eating out for all meals is not necessary either. So when it comes to your individual living costs and outlays, you really do have to try and find that happy medium where you may not be eating caviar every night, but you're also not eating 2-minute noodles every night. So I'll leave that at your discretion. Now, international travel, that's always a hot topic and a nice to have. The main thing there is to make sure that you're aware of how much that may cost or what you're going to be outlaying. And there's a big difference between doing a backpacker style tour of Europe versus staying in 5-star hotels and eating at the restaurants and doing all the things. Now, when it comes to houses, what I'd be recommending there, like a lot of people want to go straight to buying their dream house up front or straight away. That is a noble goal. However, sometimes the finances don't necessarily work in that fashion. So it does come down to looking for or buying a house that you can afford to get paid off. But basically, once you have a primary residence that you have paid off in full and has no debt, you can then still use that property to be secured against other loans to go and buy investment properties or things like that. So when it comes to the good debt versus bad debt discussion, the main thing would be to try and eliminate your bad debt as soon as possible, whether that be in 5 years' time or whatever the realistic time frame is. And once you get that bad debt out of the road, well then it does mean that there's extra funds available to go and invest and generate more cash, and then it can snowball on itself. It's also important to get good advice from an accountant before making any major investment or business decisions. While many people do claim to offer such advice, it's always good to make sure you can ask a few questions and just see what sort of depth of experience the people that you're talking to have, because it doesn't take long to get above the level of just preparing an individual tax return in that respect. We focus on dealing with compliance issues, but we also focus on providing proactive tax advice and advice in these sort of spaces. Now, if you have a look at the next page on your booklet, page number 5, what I'd like you to do is look at your current situation now, which is phase 1. You can put in there your own sort of potential income. Phase 2 we've outlined there is your internship. Phase 3 would be when you're studying a specialisation, and phase 4 would be a qualified specialist. The main things I wanted you to have a look at here is on the income side. When you look at the level of income that's there, it'll also give you an idea of how much tax you would have to pay if there was no other income or deductible expenses that have been outlined there. So when it comes to things like, living costs, which you'll see down the bottom there, if you look at phase 4 being a specialist, if you're earning 350 grand, by the time you've taken out tax, Medicare levy and all the other bits and pieces that are involved, and there would be some HECS repayment in there too, you only end up with $176,000 left over to live on, to reinvest and to do things with. So the main thing is that the headline amount, similar to what the video touched on, of saying, you know, are you earning $1 million a month or not, it isn't necessarily, I mean, the top number is important, but the bottom number, which is what is available to invest and live off, is the one that is more important. So that's basically what we want to touch on there. So what I'd like you to do is just look at, say, phase 1 now, and if you can just have a quick look at the first income section to try and outline what your income is now. Like, these books are only for your own reference anyway. And then also have a look at whatever deductible expenses that you may or may not have. And then the main ones would be down in the non-deductible outlays, things like rent. I doubt there'd be mortgage repayments there now, but even living expenses, it'd be interesting to see what your best estimates were for those numbers, even on an annual basis. So we'll have a couple of minutes to do that now. Okay, have we all finished that now? The main thing there is that when you look at the after-tax income, or the cash that would be available, and when you refer back to your goals and objectives back on page 2, it's fair to say that the further you go through your career, the easier it will be to fund those things that have been on the wish list. And as we've seen in the video presentation, generally the more people earn, the greater their personal and professional goals become. So everything gets stretched more and more over time. So that was the main point of just working through those things. But the big thing is just to make sure that you are referring to what funds are available to live off and do things with, rather than what's the headline number, because there is that tax element which will always be there. So the take-home message from this activity is that if you want to increase your financial success, you need to have a budget and a plan. I would encourage you to start saving money from your first paycheck. Pay yourself first, and by that I mean you need to set aside funds for assets that will help you build the foundation for your future, rather than letting them get swept up in daily expenses and bills. So if it is saving for a deposit for a house, out of every paycheck that comes through, it doesn't have to be half of it, but having some amount that you can just squirrel away over time, so that when it does come to 3 months, 6 months, a year, whenever it is that point of buying that first house, you've then got those funds available there to use, rather than trying to start from scratch then. The other thing that does is that it also means that by putting those funds aside, you can be trying to generate interest off that money in the short term. And when it comes to the actual purchase of a property, you would have a record there of a savings plan that you've had for however long, months or years, which from a financier's point of view is good, because they're not trying to teach you those things from scratch after you bought the house. Does that make sense? For those of you planning to become specialists who want to own their own practice someday, setting up a practice from scratch will cost, buying into a practice will cost. So having, well, the more assets that you can be building up over time behind the scenes will help you move in the direction of those goals and achieve what you're after in that space. It's also of utmost importance that you do have a knowledgeable and trustworthy accountant and financial planner that you can go to when you have questions or want to learn about the different directions you might want to move into, and just someone that can make sure that you are staying on the straight and narrow. Now, having a savings plan and putting money aside does fly in the face of some of the consumerist values around you. It can be hard to exercise fiscal self-control when others aren't. However, the long-term benefits are worth the sacrifice. So, as a prospective doctor, there are many more financial considerations you need to understand to be able to apply to your personal goals and situations. An hour is nowhere near long enough to explore all those in depth, but before we finish up, I just wanted to flag a couple for you. Many of you at some point may be considering buying into or starting your own medical business, which we've touched on. It does come down to a matter of how you configure that or set that up from scratch may have significant tax implications for you over the short and longer term. So it is vital that you get a good understanding of corporate structures. We won't be running through that today, but things like whether it's a company or a trust structure, who the shareholders are, who the trustees are, those sort of questions. And that will have an impact on your overall tax bill, which is relevant to what we've been discussing. For those that want to go down or further down the investment path, there could also be the option of setting up either a company or a trust to actually hold those investments rather than holding them in your own name. From my side, it's always a question of scale and appropriateness, and it also comes down to age and stage of life and what other things you've got tied up where. So as we've touched on, the primary or paying off the primary house that you live in, as far as I'm concerned, is target or the main event number one to be trying to aim for. And once that is squared away, then that would then provide other funds to go into investments and establishing that sort of portfolio over the longer term. Many doctors are altruistic, and charitable giving is also something that you can structure for maximum financial advantage. It does come down to making sure that some of these donations are done in the correct name to get the most value for them. And yeah, that's about all we can touch on there. Another important factor to consider is your personal and professional insurances. While you are more than likely to be covered by Queensland Health while you're an intern, it's highly recommended that you do also have your own cover during your internship, just in the case where, and I haven't heard of it happening, but if the insurers of Queensland Health were to step aside and not support you in any sort of claim against you, then it would be invaluable to have your own protection or own insurance in that respect. One disgruntled patient who decides to take you to court can destroy your nest egg through legal fees and also damage to your reputation. So again, it comes down to why would you take the risk? And for those with families or families on the way, life insurance will become a more relevant insurance to look at and review over time as well. Generally, that depends on age and stage and debt levels and a whole swag of other elements that come into those calculations as well. At the same time as preparing a will, I would also recommend that you have a solicitor prepare what's called an enduring power of attorney, so that if you were in, say, a car accident and you weren't able to make decisions on your own behalf, that would give someone the legal capacity to make those decisions for you. So enduring power of attorney and a will generally go hand in hand, but it just covers the situation where either you can't make your own decisions or if you've actually then passed away, how things get divvied up. So as we conclude today, the homework, which everyone tends to love these days, is just to revisit your goals on page 2, and I'd like you to reflect on these and to see if there's any other goals that you'd like to be adding in light of the information that we've run through. On the final page, there's an area there which you can outline what's your most important or least important goals, how you might go about financing these, and prioritise them so that you know what things you're trying to hit off at what times. Even putting dates down for when you want to have these things resolved by is always a good idea to provide some focus. I'd like to thank you again for coming along today. We'll go through questions in a minute, but I'd just like to outline that there's a couple of quotations which are quite relevant. One is that a goal without a plan is just a wish, and financial freedom is not a certain amount of money sitting in your bank account. It's when your passive income exceeds your expenses. So this has been quite a different topic to the normal things that you would be running through, and I'd just like to wish you all a happy and prosperous future with your careers. Thank you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was good, thank you.
Does anyone feel like they're spending too much money now?
Don't have too many expenses living up in Rocky at the moment, so.
Gotcha. Well, and the main thing, similar to that video, was just trying to make sure that as your income grows, it can be pretty easy to have your expenses grow to match. And if your income grows again, well, then it's also easy to have your expenses grow to match those again as well. So at the end of the day, yeah, the more you can be putting aside or paying yourself first or investing or what have you, it just means that over time you end up with a more robust game plan and strategy, which, you know, whether you want to retire at 50 or at whatever stage is totally up to you, but it just means that you've then got more financial security. So if there's things that bob up from left field, as they sometimes do, you've got more capacity there to handle things rather than skating through it by the skin of your teeth the whole time. I've got a question for you. It's a bit of a rhetorical one. What happens to your HECS debt if you die?
I think it's the same if you went overseas. You
Yeah,
pay
used
your
to.
tax.
Have they changed it so that someone has to pay it now?
Well, no, what happens is, well, if you're alive, if you don't die and you start to earn over a certain threshold, then you automatically start to pay money back out of your tax refund or what have you.
That would be us an intern, wouldn't it? Surely you mentioned 76,000 or something?
Yeah.
That's over threshold.
That's correct, yeah. If you have a look there on page number 5, yeah, we've calculated a HECS debt repayment of $4,800 based on an $80,000 intern salary. And that's basically, well, it's not voluntary, that's just how it, basically the ATO knows how much your HECS debt is, and once you exceed that threshold, they just say, thanks very much, we'll take that out of your refund and away we go. The more you earn, then the more they take out until it's paid off in full. But if you die, my understanding is that then, well, there's two options. One is either it would form part of, it'd be like a claim against your estate that would then have to be settled and dealt with, which can get bad from a PR point of view. My understanding is that if you die, then once the ATO is notified that you die, then they basically write off the HECS debt, and then that's just one less thing. Mainly because the administration of trying to claw that back from an estate which may not have a great deal in it, or there could be people who don't die with a will in the first place, would be a huge administrative burden. So it's not something to look forward to from that point of view, but at least you do then know what happens in that space. But the other thing is, I think that it keeps getting increased by around about 2% or so per year is what they add to it over time. HECS debt would be one of those ones that I would be treating as bad debt, albeit the rate that they're going to charge you or how much it's going to increase would be lower than like that of a family home. So when we talk about nailing the credit cards first, then any sort of vehicle loans or personal loans, and then the home loan for the house that you live in, the HECS debt would probably be the next one on that list. And you can always make voluntary payments of that at any time to reduce that as well.
How would you recommend paying a lot more on top to get rid of your HEX debt quickly, or putting that money into savings when what is that better or more long term?
Okay, well, given that it's only going to be increasing by around about 2% per year, I'd be, well, if I had 10 grand of cash sitting there, I'd probably put it into a term deposit and generate interest on that. You're going to earn maybe 2 to 3% on that, and you may still have to pay tax on that interest that you've earned there anyway. But that would then mean that you've got money to build up to go towards a house purchase. If that was like sometimes the advice is dependent on the situation. So if you say, rightio, I've got a 40 grand HEX debt and I've got 10 grand in the bank, should I just offset one against the other? I would say no, keep the 10 grand in a term deposit, continue to add to that and let that build up over time. And the HEX, I wouldn't say it's going to look after itself when your income gets high enough, but if you do go down like a specialty path, it might be only a couple of years of a significant income to wipe out that HEX debt completely, depending on how high it gets and if you pass all your subjects and things like that. So, having a house that's paid off in full, having cars that don't have any debt on them is probably the primary target to get to. Like, you can always have better cars, you can always have a better house. But getting to that point from a financial point of view then means that what you've got left over after that is then all available from an investment, which can then put in and then grow by itself and then start to sort of snowball. So that's where that financial security part comes in. Does that make sense? Any other questions? One for the road? Does anyone ever think about these sort of things? You do? But just not know where to go to get information about them, or? Gotcha. And that's, and to be honest, establishing those savings patterns or those habits early, like everyone knows someone who's a train wreck that got paid a lot of money and has nothing to show for it. So that's like case study number one, which is what we're trying to avoid. Whereas sometimes it doesn't take much to be able to go down a totally different path and end up with a totally different outcome. And when you add 10 or 20 years of case study one, they're generally in the same situation, whereas case study 2 or 3 might be in significantly better positions just because of some of the small decisions they've made on the way through. So yeah, my aim is not to dampen your enthusiasm, but compared to the consumeristic brief that everyone gets bombarded by with advertising every day, where if you don't have this, you're not in the cool club. Yeah, it comes down to you making your own decisions based on what you've got in front of you and what is important to you. Cool. Okay. If anyone's got any other questions they don't want to ask in a public forum, I'm happy to hang around and answer a few things anyway, but I think that's pretty much it, Angela.
Thank you, Chris.
No worries.